going to go ahead and hit record. And yeah, so thank you guys, everybody, once again for being here. And I'd like to introduce Don Hackett, the Cork Tease, who is one of our at Fermented's best advocates in the natural wine space. He is such a resource, and we're so happy to have him here tonight to talk to you guys about natural wines and what that means and what some of our favorite natural wines are right now. So Don, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey everyone, how are you? Good, thanks for joining us. So listen, what do you guys think about trying to actually have a conversation tonight? Do you think we can handle that? Maybe unmute you and let you ask some questions. I know a lot of you, so you have probably heard a bit about natural wine, and I don't know, as far as some folks that I don't know so well, what your comfort level is, but I want to hear about it. So let's give it a go. And then if it gets too out of hand by the time we get to wine 3, then maybe we'll mute it all. But I'm going to unmute you all. So welcome.
Hi,
Okay.
John. Nice to meet you.
How are you? Yep, good to see you guys. Hi, Jeannie. All right.
Yeah.
So natural wine. So they're technically, well, this is kind of funny though, because I just happened to read something the day before. Well, actually, sorry, that was Leah who told me this. Sorry, Leah. About France now does have a legal, was that in your email? Is that where I read that?
It's in my slide deck.
Okay, all right. See, I do read that stuff. So France does have a legal definition for the word natural. So you know everywhere else that technically that means absolutely nothing, right? Like in the US, natural on, chicken or whatever, there's no legal definition, it means nothing. So natural wine, generally what we are looking to do is to find folks who want to make wine without adding a whole lot of chemical additives, using, kind of technology to manipulate tannins or how much oxygen is in the wine naturally, some of those things. I think for some folks, it has come out of a desire to eliminate a lot of things that would be added to, just the same as it is to our food. All of you know, you go to a grocery store and pull a box of something and you recognize like 2 or 3 words, and then the rest is all chemicals. Well, same thing for wine, because it is a food. So there's a bunch of stuff that can be added. I think the last time I looked into it was something like to 190 or a little bit over 190 different things in the US that you were legally allowed to add to wine. That is not grapes or yeast, so there are things to make it feel heavier in your mouth, make it look darker, maybe accentuate a certain aroma, thing. So I think part of the space for natural wines is occupied by people who don't want that stuff in their body. And then I think part of the space is occupied by those that are interested in doing things the way that they had been done for almost the entire period that we had been making wine, which is what, like over 7,000 years or something like that. And what we know of as wine right now and how wine is made is really the last 100 years, right? Like filtering, a lot of stuff you see in a modern winery, like obviously you couldn't do that when there was no electricity, right? Things like sulfur and preservatives and those things, that's not, sulfur in particular is really not, in wine anyway, maybe not even 100 years yet that had been used. So I think some people will believe that the more that you manipulate a wine, the more you make it taste unlike the wine would have tasted for hundreds, in some cases, thousands of years. Obviously, we know in Italy and Spain, they've been making wine. I think Crete has, 4,000 years of history of making wine there. So anyway, so it's become super popular. It is now, we're starting to see, and you guys can start drinking by all means, don't not drink, that is why we're here. So the natural wine now, it's super popular, super trendy. And I do say those things with, a little bit of tongue in cheek. We'll see how long it lasts. There are certain people who don't care what that thing is. They just want it to be the new thing. So we'll see how that plays out. So first wine we're going to do tonight is Forlorn Hope. And so we're going to give this whole share screen thing a shot. I'm not the guy to do this usually. So, all right, that. See that? All right, cool. All right, so we talked a little bit about natural wine. There's the information on France that they just passed. And so the last little piece there, keep added sulfur dioxide below 30 milligrams per liter. That's pretty low. Anything in the US, if you are going to label the wine as organic, you cannot add any sulfur. And then if you label it as made with organic grapes, it has to be less than 100 milligrams per liter. So 30 as far as added is pretty minimal. There will always be some sulfur just through the process of fermentation. Usually that's somewhere between anywhere roughly, let's just say like 8 to 15 milligrams, or it's typically more hovering right around 10 to 12. And for a very mainstream, let's just say it's everywhere, Costco sells it, kind of Cabernet, you would expect maybe 150 milligrams, maybe 200 milligrams. Whites tend to see a little bit more. In extreme cases for like dessert wines, you might be up to 400, a little over 400 milligrams per liter. So 30 is still pretty low.
Well, and Don, if I can jump in there real quick, I think one thing that I think people get scared about the word sulfites a lot in wine, but if you also look at sulfites in like French fries, it is exponentially more than even 100 to 300. French fries, dried fruits, a lot of your common foods have sulfites in them as well. And so that's something to be aware of too if people are concerned about sulfite usage in wine.
Yeah, I think it is arguably the most common food preservative, I believe. I'm not, percent on that, but it's right up there. But to put it into perspective, like raisins are like in the 2,500 to 3,000 milligrams, dried fruit. That's why, like, seriously, like that's one thing if you are, are concerned with, sulfur, is when you get into dried fruits and raisins and stuff like that, is to really look for unsulfured. It's in makeup, it's in medicine. I mean, it's in a lot of stuff, but enough about that. Let's talk about some wine. So Forlorn Hope. So this is Matt Rorick. So cool dude. And this is will be an interesting conversation because for natural wine, a little bit of what he does is very typical of what we are seeing in the natural wine space. And that is, he doesn't really own a whole lot of his own vineyards. He is sourcing a lot of the grapes. Things change quite often. What you're having tonight, this Queen of the Sierra white, you see it's Chardonnay, Verdejo, which is a white that is indigenous to Spain, and then Muscat. This is the second vintage for this wine. Last year, it was different. It had Chardonnay, it had Riesling. Definitely did not have Verdejo. I think it might have been like Semillon or something like that. So with him wanting to be natural, obviously, he needs to source from vineyards and growers that are, certified organic or biodynamic or practicing. We are not so strict about it that we have to have the certification in a lot of cases, especially when you deal with much smaller producers, smaller families coming from, these little out in the middle of nowhere pockets in southern, Italy and western part of Spain and things, I mean, that's how they feed their family, right? And then saying, well, hey, let's, add another, 10 to 12 to $15,000 bill every year so that we can be certified. That's a lot of money in some cases. So practicing is good enough for us. One of the big things we look for naturally using indigenous yeast, the yeast population that is just, around us. What's around me will be different then, Chris is in Midtown, and yeast is somewhat that I think is relatively a little newer as far as us focusing on yeast and what it does, and the aromas and the flavors and all of the things that it adds. Quickly, just to kind of keep it simple, the indigenous yeast population, which will be very typical geographically, is not always the most dependable when it comes to fermentation. It can be a little bit more finicky when it comes to temperature, sugar, in some cases, adding a bunch of crap to your wine, let's say, because you want to make it look more purple, in some cases may mess with the yeast, right? So now the yeast doesn't want to ferment as efficiently because there's this dye in the wine. So then you've got to add something else to get the yeast back to ferment, and it's just kind of this, in some cases, vicious cycle. So anyway, so have you guys tried that? What do we think? Do we like?
Yes.
Like it.
That is like great wine, right? Because it will go with everything. You can just have a little glass because you want a glass. It's certainly got, when you look at, and, we can talk about this for a minute if you want, talking about blending and why we use different grapes and how certain grapes just always work super well together. I mean, if you were to look at this blend, Chardonnay is weight, right? Chardonnay is body. The reality about Chardonnay is not a terribly exciting grape on its own, which is not a bad thing. It happens to be a great thing because it doesn't have this super big personality on its own. It becomes this really excellent barometer of terroir and place, and you can, it reflects where it comes from better than, let's say, a grape like Riesling, right? Which is always going to be super aromatic. And, if you're not fermenting it to dryness, there's always going to be sugar there. So Chardonnay gives weight. It's also going to show things that would be typical of this particular vineyard, this particular part of California, Calaveras. Verdejo is going to be the acidity. If you take a sip of that and kind of swirl it around, you'll get a little tingle like above your teeth, maybe on the sides of your gum a little bit. That's where your palate registers grape acidity. There'll be a little tingle there. So acidity is structure in wine. It's essential in good wine. It also acts as a cleanser for your palate. So that makes the wine a little bit more food friendly. I love Verdejo, quite honestly, talking about Spain and whites, I think Verdejo is way more interesting than Albarino. I think you guys should be drinking Verdejo. Definitely give it a shot. You can find yummy little things for $15, and then I have had some things that I think are definitely worthy of being in that $30 to $40 range. But look up that grape. Try to drink that grape. It might be a little bit more summery. Because where it comes from in Spain is, super dominated by seafood, but definitely look into that grape. And then finally, Muscat, which is going to give some of that floral, some of those, white flowers that are on there. Sometimes you get almost a slightly little spiciness from Muscat, and not necessarily like heat spice, but more like kind of clovey, kind of baking spice a little bit. So as you can see, grown organically, but not certified. So lots fermented separately. That is quite common to separate things or to ferment things separately and then blend them after fermentation. And if it's going to go through mallow, and basically you're going to get a much better idea of what the wine's going to taste like after fermentation than before fermentation. So then you can see on the bottom, paired with grilled fish, yada, yada, all of that good stuff. So any questions? How do we like it? Good?
I like it.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a great little wine.
nice and light.
Yeah. Good. I mean, that's kind of like a good, like dinner party wine as well. I mean, you're not, going to, I think, doesn't lean to any extreme so much that some folks would be off put by it. So, all right, you guys want to go on to the next one, the Cellario? So this is Igrinho. So Cellario is, you see the arrow in Piemonte. So this is in the Langhi, kind of more of the, I think the western, very western side. So the Langhi Piedmont, contains Barolo, Barbaresco, arguably Italy's greatest wine. Some people are in the Barolo camp, some people are in the Brunello camp. You have a few folks that would be in the Amarone camp. So this is a cool little, polycultural, very what you would have seen all over Europe and especially Italy, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. There's grapes, I think there's grain here. I'm not sure if there's olives. It might be a little bit farther up for olive, but I believe other vegetables. So they are definitely on the organic train, minimal to no sulfur train. And then also at the same time, I mean, they're really looking to preserve a little bit of tradition. This whole thing with the liter bottle with the, bottle cap on it, that is the way that wine would have been served in a little cafe all over Europe for many, many years, right? Like you would go hang out with your friends and you basically, will take a bottle of white, a bottle of red. In almost, unless you were in like a nicer place, it probably would have been produced within 25 miles or what the closest wine region would have been. And it would have been whatever those grapes were, and it would have been a short fermentation, a short maceration, wouldn't have seen really much oak, if any oak, and would have been very either little sulfur or no sulfur because the plan is, we're going to drink this before the next harvest, right? Like this isn't stuff that we're going to lay down and age. This is stuff because, we like to drink. So this is a grape called Grignolino. So this is one of the grapes that would be indigenous to this part of Italy. The main grape in this part would be Nebbiolo. That's what goes into Barolo Barbaresco. This is where you would see a good bit of Barbera come from. There's also a red called Dolcetto. There's Bracchetto, a few others, and then Grignolino. So Grignolino, I don't know that I have ever seen a Grignolino that's like really dark red. It typically does have a little bit of a paler color like this. I believe it is rather thin-skinned. I believe it is also something that you tend to pick earlier in the season rather than later. This would be kind of the grape that, it would be very common that at harvest, if you were there picking grapes and you were helping out at the end of harvest, part of your payment would have been wine. And this probably in this part of Italy would have been the grape that that first pass that you make, right? Like sometimes harvest can last 4 or 6 weeks, right? But at the very beginning, you would have picked like Grignolino and it would have immediately gone into like maybe like a 4, 5, 6 day maceration and then a quick fermentation. So basically like a month later or 6 weeks later when harvest was over and everybody was going home, this stuff would have been bottled, right? In big old bottles like this, or you would have used, the old fiasco, the big glass bottle and like the little wicker carrying. And that would have been, there would have been a huge party, a huge fete, and then that would have been part of your payment. Like in Burgundy, it would have been the Beaujolais. In Southern Rhone, it probably would have been like the Cinsault or the Carignan, something that would have first. So you can see aged in cement, cement is great. And it would have been all over, especially Europe. And then probably more like 50s, 60s when, the US really started, rattling some cages and wine and how you make wine and what's considered great wine. That went out of favor for a little while. And now it's come back because it's great, right? Because first of all, you're not going to damage this big, 1.5 to 2 feet deep, thing of cement. It also absorbs temperature. So fermentation creates heat, which we don't want. What's great about stainless steel is that you can artificially chill the wine, but cement will absorb that heat, keep the temperature down, and it doesn't do anything as far as adding any kind of flavor or any aroma. So it's completely innocuous. And once you build it, I mean, it's, I've, been in wineries where these things are 70, 80 years old. And they, my great grandfather put them in and my grandfather used them and blah, blah, blah. So don't be afraid of cement. It's quite often used. And then you see bottled, unfined, unfiltered with minimal sulfur. So this would have probably been a pretty decent option for Thanksgiving too.
Hey, Don, so what is unfined?
All right, sorry. So fining, basically what fining would do would be to get out really super tiny, like in some cases, microscopic particles or matter, right?
Okay.
You're taking, in some cases, you would destem the grapes off, the bunch. In some cases, you would not. You would crush it all together. So you're going to have skin and seeds, in some cases, stem. There could be bugs in there, God only knows what else, when you're out in the country making, honest wine. So fining uses almost always a animal protein because, and I may get these backwards, but I believe the animal protein is positively charged. Vegetable matter is negatively charged. So what is most often used or used to be most often used is egg whites. You would get a big thing, egg whites, whip them up and literally pour it in the barrel or whatever it was where the wine was in. And as those egg whites settled through the liquid, they would attract tiny little particles. And basically it makes the wine uncloudy.
Okay.
We started seeing about a year ago, I have a feeling you'll start, this year is kind of a huge pause, obviously. But you'll start seeing a little bit more people talking about the wine being vegan, and that almost would always mean that it is unfined and they would not be using that animal protein. There's also a few clays I believe you can use, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe they're rather expensive and can be a little bit kind of difficult to work with. So a lot of times, it could be, there's fish bladder, there's pig gelatin, all of these things, and once again, right? Like, yeah, I can see your face. It's like, really? Is that what's in that wine? And I'm like, well, yeah, sometimes.
Pig's bladder.
Yeah. So anyway, all right. So how'd we like that? Good?
We did. And Don, one more question. Since this
Sure.
doesn't have a cork, does that mean once you open it, you have to drink the whole bottle?
You know what? Yes.
That's the answer we were looking for.
Honestly, if you wanted to, I've got a little, cup of corks on the counter, right? Like use a different cork. I would put it in the fridge though. If I was going to try to get I would definitely put that in the fridge. But yeah, it's simple. It's easy. It's priced, it might not be the best choice if it's just, two folks and you're just going to have one glass a night. But, if it's Friday or Saturday, some friends are coming over, or if you're going to go through the bottle, go through it. It's easy. And I can't remember, I don't have a bottle with me. But I don't think the alcohol is too high on that either. It's probably around 12 or so.
Does it say on there?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, we're professionals. We can take care of it.
There you go. Yes. Well, we're training, right? All right, so let's go. What's next? Domaine de la Pepier. Okay, so this is the Cab Franc. So this is kind of cool because this is, I think, the first or second year that he's done. Well, it's not really him so much anymore. Done the Cab Franc. So now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit because the guy you see there, Marc Olivier, and then the next wine to the Tiraldigo, Elisabetta Foradori. Now you are, as far as like for, geeks like me, people who do this professionally, people who are really into natural wine, like now we're starting to deal with some of like the icons of. So that guy right there is Marc Olivier. Those pictures are probably 10 or 15 years old. I think he's mostly retired at this point. Like, he was one of the first guys to say, we have got to stop using all of these chemicals, right? So a quick history of what he is most well known for. And you see on your map, the arrow there is pointing to that the town of Nantes. And if you go all the way west, you see that little bay, basically where the Loire River is dumping into the Atlantic. That is, and then a little bit farther south of Bordeaux, basically like that is like, you know, shellfish heaven for France, right? Like clams, oysters, conch, shrimp, like all of this amazing. And the wine that is produced right there in Nantes, the white is a wine called Muscadet. And it is classic with oysters, classic with shellfish. And for a very, very long time, the majority of the wine that was produced there was total high production, you know, like drive it around in tanker, like oil refinery type of, you know, wineries, right? And that's fine. I mean, I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing, because they produce a lot of really inexpensive wine that would have supplied most of that coast of France all summer long, right? Would have been coming from here. What you would have gotten farther south in Bordeaux would have just been too expensive for a lot of folks. So anyway, so like this huge factory farming, we don't care. Let's just get as many grapes as we possibly can, because we have to make as much wine as we can. And he was like the first guy who was like, well, wait a second. First of all, in order for you to get this quantity of grapes, what you're spraying, you are essentially killing the soil, right? A generation, 2 generations, the soil won't, you know, be able to support that life without, you know, all of these chemicals. And he also started to say, why is everybody making crappy wine, right? Like, why don't we stop a second and start looking at the different terroirs in this region, you know, doing things like when we talk about grape, when we say Pinot Noir, for instance, it's not one. There's like 680 some different Pinot Noirs, right? Some have darker skin, lighter skin, thinner, you know, some have unique aromas, some do better in certain temperatures and certain soils and things like that. And sometimes it takes a while to match the right cultivar of that grape to that particular area. So move on, this would have been kind of like 70s. By the time you got to like the late 80s and 90s, like there were literally people from all over the world coming to spend a season with him to learn how to, because at that point, really, you know, you think about the mid to late 80s, the overwhelming, almost all of wine that we would see in a shop would have been made conventional, right? Like there weren't a whole lot of people who were off on the side. It was like, this is the recipe, this is what you do. You add sulfur here, you do this, you do that. And a lot of, you know, people like Marc Olivier, for instance, a lot of those wines would not have really made it over here until you started seeing these kind of little boutique importers start popping up, like in the late 80s and early 90s, people like Louis Dresner and Rosenthal and folks who were also equally, as with the people making the wine, saying, why are we drinking all of this mass produced? Like, why does every Chardonnay have to taste oaky, right? Like, why can't some taste this way? Why does every Sauvignon Blanc, why does every Cab? So anyway, so Marc Olivier. So the white would be, Muscadet is the wine, the grape is technically Melon de Bourgogne. And the other thing that the Loire Valley does exceptionally well is Cabernet Franc. Like for people who are really into Cabernet Franc, this is where you traditionally go for Cabernet Franc. Now, the arrow that you're seeing there, Nantes, you don't grow Cabernet Franc there. You grow Cabernet Franc a little farther over here, where you would see like Chinon and Bourgogne. What's the other one? Some more Champagny. These are, Chinon would arguably be, you know, the most famous of villages that produce reds of Cabernet Franc. And that's what you're having right there. So the Loire Valley had a few disastrous vintages, especially 16 and 17. At one point, Pepier, which for pretty much its entire history had been all estate, which means that they grew all of the grapes that they used to make their wine. It is not uncommon for folks to, grow some, if not most, and then maybe supplement that. The last wine you did, the Forlorn Hope, he was buying pretty much everything. But a couple of vintages ago, I think they lost something like over 70% of their crop. And there was a neighbor of theirs who had some vineyards, and through the course of some conversations, they ended up kind of starting to manage those vineyards. So this La Pepie is a line of wine that is still being made by Domaine de la Pepier, but it is a blend of estate and purchased fruit, where, like all of the single vineyard stuff, I don't know if Adam still has any. The Clos de Briord, that is arguably one of the best muscadets I've ever had in my life. I mean, it would change your mind about muscadet. So if Adam has some of that, buy that. And then, so that Cabernet Franc there, you'll see a little bit lighter. You guys getting almost a little bit of like a green kind of pepper, or maybe a little bit, excuse me, of a little vegetative quality there. That's very typical of Cabernet Franc that is grown in a cooler environment. A lot of Cab Franc that you're going to get, like, let's say maybe out of Napa Valley, you start getting into much bigger, heavier aromas, chocolate, coffee, stuff like that. Do you guys like that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
All right, let's see. I'm gonna stop the share for a little bit. So now that I can see everybody, any other questions? How we doing out there? We good?
So how many different wines are there out there?
How many different what?
Wines, like just different, like this is Cabernet Franc and.
Well, as far as grapes, I think technically the number is somewhere around 1,300.
Oh my gosh.
But I think somewhere between 800 and 900 are actually used in production. So, and the other thing too is, once again, we could be growing Pinot Noir in Marietta, and then I decide that I'm going to move, to Athens, and I take some of that Pinot Noir with me and I plant it in Athens. Well, eventually that plant is going to change genetically and become a different, so, but as far as like Cabernet, all of those, roughly around 800-ish in production that you would see. And remember too, there's to be cases where it's actually probably the same grape, but it's just called something different, and there's really no record of any kind of lineage, the last wine we did, that Igrigno, in that area of Italy, just in that one little region, Nebbiolo is called like 5 or 6 things.
Oh.
Different grapes, because that's how little, 200 years ago people were traveling, even within just a couple hundred miles of each other, right? It's Nebbiolo in south, it's Chiavenesca up in close to Valdosta, it's called Spana up in the northeastern part. So I'm sure that some of those 800 have got to be duplicates in some way. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
So many wines, so little time.
No, we got plenty of time. We just have to be dedicated. All right. So if we're good, then let's move on to that last wine. All right. So you guys are in for a treat. I don't know if you've tasted this or not, but I had this wine out last week, and it is smoking good right now. So this is literally one of my favorite wines. She is, I am not the type of person to really get all wrapped up in, hero worship and stuff like that. I think folks are folks. But when she was in town last year and we went to dinner, like I was, I think I might have fallen in love that night.
We all were.
Yeah. I mean, the wines are so amazing. She is about as authentic as you can ask a human being to be. It's a cool story. So we are up kind of in the northeastern part of Italy, what they call the Dolomites. You see those beautiful mountains there, and that is literally one of her vineyards. And there's a little church that's right there. Chris was there with me. We went a few years ago. This is like one of the most beautiful places on the planet, for me anyway. So it's a little grape called Tiraldigo, right? And you are, you're probably a half hour-ish away from where you would see a lot of ski resorts. And Tiraldigo would have been the little local grape variety that would have made the local red that would have supplied like all of these, hotels and ski resorts and all of this kind of stuff. So she's a kid, she's in high school. Her father, has this land. He's basically growing grapes. I don't think he's making wine. I believe he is basically just selling it off to the co-op. So his motivation is to grow as much. Basically, you're selling it by the kilo. Let's make as much as we possibly can. Blah, blah, blah. Her father, I don't remember how, but passes away, right? She's the oldest. She has to start assuming some of these duties because basically this is how the family survives, right? So this would have been, God, I think this was what, maybe 30 years ago or so. So here she is. She's in high school. Doesn't particularly care about wine, doesn't particularly care to make wine, is a female in a very patriarchal society and a uber patriarchal industry of winemaking. And she spends a season or two kind of getting her feet under her. Eventually, she starts falling in love with the land, she says, and therefore the vines and the grapes that are coming out of that land, and eventually starts doing some of the things that the last guy did, Mark Olivier, like, why am I using all of these chemicals? Why am I, and the other part, and this is something that I kind of got from speaking to her, is, you look at these chemicals that they're using on the vines, like they would have, like, for instance, someone who's multi-generational, they remember a time when there were no chemicals, right? Like some of these places, some of these folks that are making this supernatural wine or have a vineyard that's never seen anything synthetic, it's like a joke, right? They're like, we didn't know that we were doing anything. We just didn't have the money to buy all of these fertilizers, right? So we didn't. But you look at a place like this, like the last guy, Mark Olivier, Cellario. The other thing that these folks all had were these really huge gardens, right? They're growing a lot of their own vegetables, a lot of their own food, and they're not using any of those chemicals on their zucchini and their eggplants and their tomatoes because you just never did, right? And so people like Elisabetta starts questioning, why am I using all these chemicals? Why am I treating these two things differently? Right? Like, why can't I use some of the same practices, natural weed control, maybe doing a little bit of plowing, but also letting nature get back into balance, and then it kind of takes care of itself, So like, I wish I need to see if I don't know if I'm gonna have time to find any of these other pictures of when we were there, but she does all of her own compost, right? And this would have been these mounds that would have been like 3 or 4 feet high, maybe 6 feet wide, and went for like 40 yards, right? Like this whole little area. And she had 3 different ones, and it took 3 years for her to get her compost to the way that she wanted, right? And it would have been everything that would have been grown naturally that would have created this compost. She's got chickens running around. She uses pergola, which is the method of letting the vines kind of grow up above and then the clusters hang below, which kind of saves it from the and then, you know, she wasn't doing anything in the cellar other than just letting the local yeast ferment those grapes into alcohol, right? And you don't really need a whole lot of sulfur there. You know, I think that these are wines that will age. And when you start getting into some of the single vineyard, the Scarzon and the Moret and the Granato, you know, those would go probably 15, 20 years, but this isn't a cab. This isn't a Syrah, right? Like, I don't know that we're going to be drinking Tyrrell to go 60 or 70 years down the road. So why do you need much preservation, right? If you do things properly, the other thing too is carbon dioxide is a natural byproduct of fermentation, and carbon dioxide also acts as a natural preservative. There are ways to kind of trap a little bit of that during fermentation, which kind of acts to preserve the wine, so you don't need to add sulfur in that instance. So, all right, so tell me, do you guys like that?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, is that not, like, that's beautiful. Now, so here's one other little thing we'll talk about. We got a few minutes left about natural wines is you will, and this is a perfect example, and I hope some of you will fall in love with this wine so that in 3 years from now, we'll bring this up again and you'll be able to say, yeah, I remember. Not every vintage is going to be exactly the same, right? Like, this is the perfect example, not only of vintage, but also within the vintage. So what you are drinking, I believe, is the third drop of this wine that we got this year. And for her, this is, with this importer, we do it a little differently. Like, the wines are not purchased and then stored in New York. We buy directly from the winery because the wine, it's better for it to be at the winery, blah, blah, blah. So what's interesting is to watch how this wine has evolved even over this year, right? Like, this wine versus what we would have been drinking, I think that we would have gotten, I think we got the first pop in like February, and then we got another one in like April or May. So that like summer pop, it was a little tight. It wasn't quite so expressive. And then this stuff we just got, like, that is, yeah, that's ready to go. So
It's so good.
all right. Question?
So how am I going to know that I've got the, yes, I have a question.
Go ahead.
John, how am I going to know I got this drop of this wine as opposed to one of the earlier ones that are, this is wonderful, but I want this one.
Well,
I don't want one that's,
you know, most likely, you know, I mean, I know Fermented has probably, you know, I mean, I know that I have shipped them stuff from this last drop. So if you bought this wine for this tasting, then that's what you're getting. And, you know, that's not to say that that other last bottle may not have also tasted this good at this point, but it was definitely, you could see the evolution of this wine even within a year. There are some wineries that leave the wine in these huge tanks, right? And they bottle it 5, 6, 7 times a year, you know, like they'll rack up a bunch of orders and then it'll be, you know, bottling week and they'll pump out a bunch of cases and get them shipped. But generally, you know, some folks may think that their wine ages better in a smaller vessel like the bottle, and some may think that it's going to do much better, you know, staying in neutral oak, stainless, or cement. You know, it's kind of like with art, right? Like you get, you know, 5 artists together, they're all going to argue about which that's red, right? I mean, it's just, I think, an issue of preference and really how you want also maybe the wine to express itself when the customer finally opens it. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, those are the things that as soon as you ask that question, I'm like, maybe I shouldn't have said that.
maybe you should.
Well, we do have another question, Don. What was the production process on the Four Dory?
I mean, it's basically, you know, I mean, I believe she will allow herself the option to possibly add sulfur at bottling, and I don't always know if she did or not. So she's not using it in the vineyard and she's not using it during fermentation. So those are the three places you would use sulfur. You would use it in the vineyard because it kills everything, including the indigenous yeast. So if you, for instance, want to make, like, let's say 1 million bottles of something, and you're going to be needing to source grapes from areas that might be hours away, or in some cases, maybe a different state away, one of the ways you make things taste consistent is to eliminate some of the variables, right? So you would spray the heck out of the vineyards of the fruit that would kill the indigenous yeast. So then you would use a lab cultured yeast, which gives you a much more predictable result. You would also, and especially this would have been done a little bit more in the old days when you were using a lot more open top fermenters, is you would spray during fermentation because you would want to kill a whole lot of microbiology, things that might possibly spoil the wine, might possibly add an off flavor or aroma. And then you would, and what is still most often and still within natural wine will also be accepted, that you would add a little sulfur at bottling.
Thank
Go.
you.
All right.
So what was everybody's favorite? And you can either put it in the chat or you can say it out loud. I'm feeling a lot of four dories.
Four dory.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, yes.
You like that green?
Number 4.
Yeah, 4 dory.
4 times 3.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good, and I hope that for some of you, I know a lot of you, and I know this is not the first time you've had this wine, because if you hang out with me, you will absolutely be drinking this wine. But I hope for some of you, it's the first time you've had this grape, right? And that's the lesson. There is really awesome, amazing wine being made everywhere. In every horrible vintage, somebody got it right and made great wine. In even the best vintages, some, idiot screwed it up. That, I guess, really is not my point. My point is that try some new stuff, right? Like, you guys are in the right place at Fermented, because they are not, it's amazing. You would be surprised at how, not that it happens a whole lot, but it still happens that even with that last wine, Teraldigo, as absolutely wonderful as it is, a store would say, yeah, sell it, people don't know what Teraldigo is. And I'm like, well, then get out from behind the desk and tell them what it is, right? But don't, definitely don't limit yourself. And restaurants are always a great place too, especially if it's by the glass. If you go to a decent restaurant, say, what's the coolest, weirdest thing you've got by the glass? $10, $12 bucks to try something. But, in this case, turned out to be amazing, right? That's right. So, okay. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, this doesn't have to do with natural wines, but, and maybe most of you on this call are already familiar with this, but I have to say that when I went to pick up these 4 bottles the other day, I was really surprised that it was a bottle cap on one of them. So, and I know you mentioned it earlier that that's been going on for years in Europe, but will you just give me kind of an overview of the bottle cap going to the cork, now back to the screw top, just like a bird's eye view?
So, first of all, it's cost. A really good cork, like a really long, good cork, something that would be in a wine that might, potentially age for 40, 50 years, it can be up to $2 a cork.
Wow.
Where a cap is, pennies, right? So for a wine like the Cellario, that the intention behind it is to drink it. Right? Like, we're not going to age it. We're not going to lay it down. Like, could it possibly get better? Sure. Could possibly. Would I, put any effort into it, expecting it to get better by aging it? I personally would not, and that's fine, because we all need that little inexpensive thing tonight to go with spaghetti. And then there's the night where it needs to be amazing and wonderful. So, the other problem with cork is it is a natural resource that we are, simply cannot keep up with the demand. It's the bark of a tree that grows basically along the Mediterranean, blah, blah. It needs to be cleaned chemically. And in some cases, so this would have been maybe going on 20 years, 15, 20 years. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the California producer BV, Beaulieu Vineyards. It's, yeah, so they're like one of the original greats, the George de la Tour. They're like super high-end cab, you know. I mean, that goes back, you know, 100. It's like one of the originals, that and Ingle Nook. And anyway, so they had a mid-tier wine, I think it was called like Tapestry or something. And even 20 years ago, it was like 35, 40 bucks, whatever. So there was one vintage where they had to throw out the entire vintage because the corks they used had not been cleaned properly.
Wow.
Ooh.
Bacteria in the cork that spoiled the wine. You know, back in the day, you know, they sued the cork maker. That's when things started to change and we started seeing plastic, and they started doing things like you take the cork and you grind it up so that you can clean everything. Because if you just leave the cork whole, I mean, how do you get the bacteria that's all the way in the very center, you know, things like that. It is cost, it is dependability, you know, cork can dry out, oxygen into the wine, you know, really, this is kind of cool. Most people don't know, like the really super high-end, top-end wineries around the world, like some of the really expensive Bordeaux's like Margaux and Mouton Rothschild and Petrus. So restaurants that buy their wines and expect to store their wines for 50, 60, 100 years, wineries have teams that go around all over the world to recork their bottles because the corks will only last, you know, like they'll say 20 years or whatever. So whoever's got, you know, 89 ton in a cellar somewhere, you know, the team goes, I mean,
Holy smoke.
you know, that would be another cost, right? But anyway, I thought that was just kind of cool, like these little ninja cork,
That is cool.
you know. Yeah, I mean, it's like there's some kind of special contraption that they can pull the cork out, put a new one in and not allow any oxygen and all this kind of stuff. But to answer your question, mostly cost and mostly just to not have anything possibly go bad. I mean, it's all perception, right? You know, back in the day with screw caps, you know, we used to make fun of that. And it was like, you know, that's, you know, you wouldn't possibly drink a wine with a screw cap, although I can tell you there were jugs of Lancers at my house as a kid. So we were a screw cap family for sure.
At least it's not out of a box.
Yeah, whatever, you know. You know how it is. If mom's happy, everyone's happy, right?
Yeah, even Boone's Farm had a cork in it, I think, if I remember right.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that was probably more about the sugar than anything. You know? It was just sweet, so.
Thank you.
All right, guys.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
well, I
much.
had a blast. So
Thank you
we'll
so
get
much.
some, we'll get something scheduled for next year. You guys have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Drink
Like-
lots, and we'll see you soon.
All right.
All right,
Bye.
good night.
Bye.
Guys,
Good
have a
night.
good night.
Bye.
Thank you, Leah.
Cheers.
Oh, another. That's cute.